What I found as I began to explore American writers during the Civil War was an image of the volcano. I kept encountering references to volcanoes in the journals and in the diaries and in the poetry and the short stories of all of these writers, of Emerson, Whitman, Dickinson, Melville, and on and on. And I was intrigued by this image. Why at the time leading up to and during the Civil War with the volcano seemed to be so compelling and interesting to these writers. And what I eventually came to realize is that it stood for two things. One of which was the creative process of the Romantic poet. Emily Dickinson, in a surprising number of poems, writes about volcanoes. And what she's usually saying is that she is a kind of volcano as a poet. Sometimes she says, I don't make as much noise as a volcano, but I'm erupting within, and those kinds of things. Emerson had in the hallway of his house a lithograph of Mount Vesuvius, which he'd picked up in the 1830s when he traveled to Italy, and he kept it there for the next 50 years of his life. Herman Melville in Benito Cereno talks about the problems of race relations as a slumbering volcano, and he's stolen that line actually from a speech by Frederick Douglass, where Douglass mentions the slumbering volcano. So all of these references to the volcano kept coming up and kept coming up. And I realized that it was in some ways a reference to the artistic process, but it was also an anxious image about the eruption of America, the disintegration of America, the combustion of these two vehemently opposed sides in the national culture. And so the volcano is both something that these writers are attracted to but afraid of. And that's a long way of kind of saying that what my book ultimately came to be about was the way American writers both longed so much for the transformation of America in which slavery would disappear on the one hand, but how that longing was challenged to its very core by the enormous and unprecedented amount of violence and death that the Civil War created. And what my book traces out biographically is how these various writers experienced that conflagration and that violence.
So I know that a lot of authors and writers and all sorts of thinkers during World War II, and I think also during the American Revolution, left, decided that it was bad for their creative process around that type of thing.
Yeah.
Did you see that many of them were drawing during this Civil War?
Yeah, it's really American writers, the canonical classic American writers that we know from our American Lit 1 and 2 classes responded in a variety of ways to the war. Some of them, like Herman Melville, who had actually kind of trashed his career by writing increasingly unpublishable novels and uncritically successful or critically unsuccessful novels, actually saw the Civil War as a chance to try to rescue his career. And he launches upon this incredibly ambitious program to remake himself as a poet. And he's going to be the poet of the Civil War. Walt Whitman does the same thing. But the war also severely affected some of those writers' creative projects. And the one that I think of most poignantly is Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had spent almost all of the 1850s in Europe on a political appointment. But his idea was he was going to make a lot of money doing that, and he was going to come back to the United States where he was going to write one wonderful book after the other. In his late 50s and 60s. And he came back to America, in 1860, he came back to America that was essentially on the cusp of civil war. And once the war occurred, or broke out, he attempted to write several different romances. and he simply can't do it. He's silent. He's silenced by the war. He's so depressed by the violence and the social disruption that he just says romances are no longer possible. So he was deeply affected, and perhaps the most enigmatic of all of these figures is Emily Dickinson, who is not a known writer at the time. She's an obscure woman in her 30s in Amherst, but she, upon her death, 2 decades later in the 1880s, her sister opens up a wooden chest at the foot of her bed and discovers 1,800 poems. Many of them are really wonderful, wonderful poems. Everybody knew that she wrote poems, but nobody had any clue that she wrote poetry to that extent. And over the last century or so, a number of scholars have done a great job of dating her poems, because she didn't date them, she didn't title them, she just wrote them and sewed them together in little books and then put them in this chest. And over the years, scholars have determined that nearly half of those poems were written during the Civil War. So there was something about the Civil War, and she doesn't tell us what it is, but there was something about that trauma that energized her as a poet and made her enormously productive. She talks about writing at a white heat. And so the war made Emily Dickinson a poet in many ways.
Did you start out with the concept of writing this book, or did it sort of evolve from other research?
I'll tell you how I came up with deciding to write the book. Is I just finished a book on Emerson, and I was doing what I always encourage my students to do, which is go to the library and just stroll around the stacks and look at different books for ideas. And I was in the American literary history section, and I noticed a really interesting thing, which was there were tons of books, dozens and dozens of books about the 1850s, which is in many ways the heyday of 19th century American writing. And there were a similar number of books about the rise of realism in the 1870s, but there was nothing that really addressed the American Civil War and American literature, except for a couple of wonderful books. Edmund Wilson's book called Patriotic Gore is one of them. And that just made me curious. Why hadn't anyone decided to write books about these classic American authors and how they experienced the Civil War, because they were all alive during that time.
So would you say overall that it was a good thing for American literature?
That's a great question. It transformed American literature. Prior to the Civil War, American literature was transcendental literature. It was devoted to ideals, to intuition, to metaphysics, to a sense of the divinity in man and the divinity in nature. After the Civil War, it's really hard for a younger generation of American writers to feel that confident and that transcendental and that idealistic, because their sense of things is that those ideals are what helped fuel the Civil War. And so what occurs after the Civil War, of course, is the rise of American realism, and which focuses on interactions between human beings, and we're not going to talk about what God wants or the divinity in man. We're going to just focus on the here and now.
Do you see a similar transformation? I mean, obviously, the sort of declining American economy and our declining place in the world is nothing compared to the carnage of the Civil War, but do you see a similar transformation between the post-war authors and their view of America and what we're seeing now in modern American writers? I
think that this is a pendular swing in American history, in American cultural history and literary history. And I'm thinking particularly of the wave of writing, for example, that came after World War I, where suddenly a more cynical, less idealistic writing by people like Ernest Hemingway and T.S. Eliot and those kinds of folks emerges. I think a similar thing happens in the late 20th century, and to be perfectly honest, it's so hard to tell what's going on in the living moment. But there definitely seems to me to be, you know, a sense of decline and reassessment right now that summons up the post-war periods that we've had before.